Today is April 20th, 2023, and my guest is economist Casey Mulligan of the University of Chicago. This is Casey's third appearance on EconTalk. He was last here in October 2016, talking about Cuba. Our topic for today is drug regulation, including Operation Warp Speed, which was the government's program to expedite and encourage the creation and distribution of COVID vaccines. Casey, welcome back to EconTalk.
Hi, Russ.
So our conversation today is loosely based on a recent article of yours late last year in the Journal of Law and Economics. It's part of a special issue in honor of Sam Peltzman. The title of your article was Peltzman Revisited, Quantifying 21st Century Opportunity Costs of Food and Drug Administration Regulation. The Food and Drug Administration also goes by the abbreviation FDA. Let's talk about Peltzman's original article on the FDA that you're revisiting. It's a 1973 piece that really got an immense amount of attention, and it has had a huge impact. What was his finding? What was he looking at?
The FDA began in the early 20th century. I forget the exact time, but they were just supposed to check that new drugs coming online were safe. Whether they achieve, the clinical goals or not was a different issue. And then in 1962, I believe, they were given a second mandate, which is to confirm that the new drugs were also effective. And Peltzman's study, which was published in the early 1970s, was looking back at how's it gone since 1962 now that the FDA has gotten into that new business. And he had a famous chart. I don't know, you'll probably include it with the podcast here, showing new drugs coming out of the market, and they just take a nosedive after 1962. And that's what people usually remember about the paper. Then the idea being, two ideas. One idea would be, well, there's entry barriers to entering that market, so fewer people entry when you raise the barrier, because getting that extra approval from FDA requires time and resources. Now, the other point of view is, well, that's the whole point. There were ineffective drugs. I'm taking the charitable view to FDA here. There were ineffective drugs that were making it through before 1962, and now they're not there, so they're not in the total. The part of Sam's paper that people don't remember as well, but it's crucial, is, well, how do you distinguish those two? What are the character of the drugs that would have come online after 1962, but we didn't see? It's not so easy because we don't see them. And so he did two things. One is he said, well, we had other judges of the efficacy of drugs before the FDA got in that business, so to speak. And he points to two. One being doctors, physicians, I believe it was the AMA, Physician Association, had taken upon themselves to recommend to their members, should you use this drug? Is it achieving the clinical goals? And Sam used that to show that there weren't a whole lot of ineffective drugs coming online before the FDA became a gatekeeper. Then the other thing he did is said that, well, the market will eventually figure it out. So what he did, we look at the rate of decline of sales of new drugs. Because before 1962, in the charitable FDA view, would be, well, we got drugs coming online, some of them are ineffective, and market eventually figures it out, and they're not able to sell that drug after a period of time. So new drugs should have pretty low growth rates in their sales on average before 1962. And then the Fed would clean that up because they would censor out the drugs that market would be in the process of discovering their wastefulness. And so drugs would grow at a higher rate. And those are two things.
You said the Fed, you mean the market would clear that up?
Yeah, the market, yes. So those are the two things he looked at, and both of them pointed to very little addition of the FDA to those market and expert processes that were already in place before 1962. So Sam concluded, they're just a barrier to getting in here, and they're not a very good sensor on top of what the market was already offering.
And, this became I think economists cared more about this than the average person. In many ways, our profession, going back to Frederick Bastiat, the French economist, we're interested in not just the seen, but the unseen. And the claim, which Peltzman effectively was making, and other economists have echoed it since, is that the FDA kills people. That drugs that would have otherwise come online or been available sooner because the regulatory process would have been shorter, were delayed or didn't happen at all. And it discouraged innovation. And while it's nice that people didn't waste money on ineffective drugs, it was not nice that drugs that might otherwise have come along didn't, or came along later, and that was horrible for human health. Something akin, to take a strange, perhaps for a non-economist, a strange analogy, things that make airplane travel more expensive and push people into driving their cars, which of course are much more dangerous than traveling by than plane. And because demand slopes downward, because people respond to prices, and certainly in travel, less so in drugs because they're often paid for by third parties. But the FDA is done bad. It's not just like, oh, they were maybe imperfect. They were having a net negative effect on human well-being. Did Peltzman try to measure the magnitude of the harm?
Yes, it was based mostly off that picture that I mentioned, the number of drugs that were missing, and I think his conclusion was, well, this particular new mandate of the FDA is costing prescription drug consumers on average about 5 or 10% of their spending. He analogized it to having a 5 to 10% excise tax on prescriptions,
which seems kind of small.
Yeah. Back then, especially now, the prescription drug market is quite a large market now. Yeah.
But it wasn't seen as small, in my view, and at least my perception in the profession was viewed as devastatingly bad for people. And through most of my lifetime as a professional economist, I've mentioned this many times on the program, the complaint about the FDA among economists is they just take too long. And that has a costly effect on the incentives to innovate, but also just availability of things that might help people lead healthier or longer lives. In recent years, and we'll get to COVID in a second, but in recent years, my feeling is that the FDA approves things. They take a long time still. They're a little faster maybe than they used to be, but they still take a long time. They approve a lot of drugs that are, quote, effective, but only marginally more effective than the existing drugs on the market, and thereby maintain the profits of the industry with very, very, very small benefits for consumers in terms of health. Talked a lot about this with Vinay Prasad and others, that on average you might get an extra month of life, and that preserves the monopoly power of a new drug that isn't much better than its existing drugs, delays the advent of generics, and that is the biggest complaint one could have with the FDA now. Do you agree with that assessment?
Well, sometimes what you're referring to is the Me Too drugs, or they're marginal additions to what's already available, and maybe FDA gets some of the blame for that. I mean, certainly there's a relationship between the industry and the FDA. I mean, George Stigler told us not to be surprised by that.
Yes, he did.
But another factor is the threat of price control. So if you have a radically new drug that's really valuable because it's not just replacing some previous drug, you're not going to have competition by definition of that. And you're going to charge a lot. And then, the do-gooders in Washington are going to come and take your profits. So that's another force toward, trying to escape regulation in the future. You just do a Me Too innovation rather than a blockbuster.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to get some measure of how the magnitude of those effects. A lot of drugs that are effective, much better than the existing stable of treatments that doctors have and patients have to choose from, still do charge an immense amount of money for them, and that those prices are set kind of bizarrely in that often the government, Medicare, isn't allowed to negotiate. Foreign governments do all the time. My drugs here in Israel are dirt cheap. It deludes some people into thinking that the Israeli healthcare system is great. There are parts of it that are pretty great. I've been lucky so far and enjoyed my interaction with the healthcare system, but drug prices are a particularly good example, and devices generally, medical device pricing is similar, where something looks very inexpensive, but that's because we here in Israel and elsewhere around the world are free riding on the only place where manufacturers can make money, and that's in the United States market, often providing 50% or more of the profits of a new drug are coming from that unregulated monopoly opportunity for American drug companies. So I think there's some still pretty big opportunities for profits there for the industry. You could argue it's not big enough. Drugs that are thousands of dollars a month and mostly paid for, of course, by Medicare subsidy is, and then to the rest of the world, dirt cheap because they negotiate, is a very strange model. It doesn't seem like a very healthy model for the system.
I'm not sure the free ride is so free. In Israel, it's a little bit unusual. You guys pay with your data. But putting that aside, in Europe in general, they're getting the drugs later. I believe the average delay is like 3 years on new drugs. You look at cancer oncology, where we have all kind of new drugs, and look at, what are the cancer patients in Europe getting treated with? They're getting treated with the older stuff.
Yeah.
And it's showing up in survival. Conditional on the size of the tumor they discover. If they discover the tumor in the United States, you're going to live something like 18 months longer. And yeah, those new drugs are more expensive. It's not free.
Why is there a 3-year delay? Is that because they don't usually have more regulatory hurdles for approval? Is that an approval then of the dispensary essentially?
Yeah. I mean, the drug is not just a chemical. It has to be distributed. The doctors need to be informed and brought online. And what's your hurry when you're not going to make any money in England or France or wherever it is? Whereas in the United States, we also have this pharmaceutical benefit manager system that helps on day one. When FDA does thumbs up, there's a whole financing there ready to go for the patients to get it on day one. And they're incentivized to do that because there's a lot of money on the table. I mean, this is a mistake we economists try to discourage. Is like, the product is not just some like chemical or, Coke and Pepsi. It might be the same darn chemical, but there's other parts to the product and they can be boring. Look at the socialist systems. They focus just on the kind of narrow definition of what a product is, and they miss all the other things, distribution and understanding and information. These are boring, but they make the world go round. And guys making money do the boring stuff and allow us to have what we have.
Yeah, it's often, a lot of people think that coming up with a good idea is the road to wealth. It's a very small part of it. Forgetting pharmaceuticals for a moment, rest of areas of our lives, there are a lot of other pieces to it, as you suggest, that are often more important. You'll hear somebody say, "Oh, well, they had that idea. I had it too." As a person in the street, forgetting that having the idea is only a very small part of putting it into a. It's not just a question of marketing or distribution. It's also a question of making it actually usable, and that is often an enormous piece of the innovation story. I make an analogy. I don't know if you agree with this, but I'm an enormous fan of Adam Smith, but I'm happy to concede that many of his ideas came from other people, or he certainly wasn't the first to develop them, but he developed them very well. And he wrote very well, and he wrote clearly and with a little bit of humor. And that counts. It doesn't count. It's not a small thing. It's a big thing. And to say, oh, well, yeah, all he did was write up other ideas, people that other people had come up with. Some of them, yes, he was able to pull them together in a way no one had before. He had some of his own insights, but above all, he packaged it in a way that was palatable and was pleasant to consume because he was a brilliant writer. And I think that's not unimportant.
I agree. And then there's an example in the paper that we're talking about today, where I believe I pointed out in this paper that you take the Oxford vaccine. I mean, they got a formula, just not the same as Pfizer's formula, but for our purposes, they basically got the formula. That's the thing you're talking about. You invented the thing. But they were philosophically opposed to working with for-profit companies. So they broke their deal with Merck. Merck is capable of doing all the boring stuff, like making it 1 billion times over. Making the first 3 batches is exciting. The remaining billion are very boring, but they were capable of doing that. The whole distribution. And so they fired Merck because they were going to earn a profit, and that's evil. And they end up getting AstraZeneca, which promised to earn no profit. But it delayed the rollout of that vaccine by about 3 months. And that had a tremendous cost.
Well, let's turn to the COVID vaccine. We had Greg Zuckerman on the program talking about the science and the intellectual innovation that the mRNA vaccines represented. It is an amazing story. What role did Operation Warp Speed, the government program to subsidize that process? What was the idea behind Operation Warp Speed?
And I don't know if you mean historically, but we had in our National Security Council a lady, Luciana Borio, who had worked back to the AIDS era, and she was concerned about national security implications of disease, and she felt that vaccine was a very important national security tool to protect us from that perspective. And we were working. We happened to be across the hall from her, a bit of an accident. We were working with her because we had economic expertise on vaccines, particularly, and FDA in general. And so the idea, we didn't call it warp speed back then, but the idea is, well, in the pandemic, there are different trade-offs between speed and efficacy. Makes no sense to wait 3 years to have the super effective vaccine versus having one that's kind of effective right away. And so we concluded more on the economic side that the regulatory hurdles must be different and lower. And second of all, there may be some role for advanced purchases so that the manufacturers can do some of the boring stuff without worrying whether drug is going to be even worth doing the boring stuff with.
So what year is this, Casey, and what were you doing across the hall?
2018, I was working in the White House Council of Economic Advisors. It's across the driveway from the West Wing of the White House, the Eisenhower building. And we were on one side of the hall, and Ms. Borio was on the other side of the hall on the national security offices. And we had a team of very good economists in general, but also experts on health. So we were engaged actually with a lot of FDA issues before getting into this national security issue. And so that was in 2018 when we began that project. President Trump was very excited about it. So normally we do a project, we roll out a report, nobody pays attention. But the president said, please don't roll this out quite yet because I want to get a spot in my calendar so I can be engaged with this because I think this is really important. So we did. So it wasn't until 2019 that we rolled out the report. The president wanted, he doesn't do reports, he does executive orders. So he put an executive order and said things like, we may get a virus, it might be from a bioweapon, it may be from escape from an animal, but we need to have it. I'm ordering all my agencies to do things different, do it fast. We're going to have advanced purchases. And he had a signing ceremony. Dr. Fauci dressed up in his doctor outfit and came over. First time he had met Trump. Nobody paid attention except those of us around the White House. We were very excited by it because this was September of 2019. And 5 months later, we would have COVID and we would call it Operation Warp Speed.
So I like the idea that EconTalk will be valuable for a long time, maybe even after I'm gone, and either it is archived or renewed with a new host, but it already seems like ancient history. I'm imagining that, 20 years from now, people will be studying the COVID pandemic, and this conversation may help provide some background. So I want to move forward to March of 2020. I remember my father was dying, and I went to visit him many times in the hospital. Turns out he had SARS. He may have had COVID, I don't know. But to go visit him in the hospital at that time, he had many other things wrong. The SARS just was like a side thing. We, as the visiting family, had to gown up and mask up. And I remember, and by the way, the employees didn't pay any attention to those rules. And I'd say, aren't you wearing a mask? They'd say, oh, everybody here has SARS. It's in everybody's system already. And okay, my dad was 88, I think, at the time. It wasn't or 89. It was not a for him, SARS wasn't. He needed some help with his lungs, sadly. But here we are wearing these masks, and we had already begun to hear reports. This is March. We had to hear very early March, late February. We heard reports of some possible scourge that was coming our way, and we had no idea of knowing anything about how likely that was. But the part I remember is we were using masks very cavalierly, meaning, you put a new one on, you try this one, you put another one on, they would break, and I joked with the nurse that, hey, so maybe these are going to be really valuable. She had a box of them. And of course, the other thing that was memorable about that time, again, pre-COVID, a week or 2, 3 weeks before it really hit here, there was Purell running wild in that hospital. As an economist, I remember thinking, I think we're a little too clean here. This is a little bit unhealthy to be killing every germ. But there are dispensers on every wall and in every hallway, and it's easy access, baby. I mean, you one pump, you get a big giant dollop of it, and you use it multiple times. So shortly after this, again, now at the end of March, there are, I would say, I might be wrong, three. I'll count in a second. 3 things that I, as an economist, was deeply worried about. Availability of masks, availability of ventilators, which at the time seemed to be the only life-saving treatment for people who were struck by this first version of COVID, and a vaccine. So we had no vaccine. We, quote, had a ventilator shortage. He had not stockpiled them, and Trump was talking about doing crazy things like getting General Motors in the ventilator production business. And third, we didn't have enough masks. And one of the things that upset me, I'd love to hear your thoughts from the inside at that time, was that there was zero discussion of any kind of market process that might help with this. Masks, people who sold masks at a premium were either sometimes arrested or threatened with jail or fined for price gouging. Ventilators similarly there didn't seem to be any kind of market response. And of course, we were told that vaccines, oh my gosh, even if someone could create a vaccine, I mean, it's going to take years. at least a year and a half or more to get, if not more than that, to get government approval. So don't count on vaccines. And ventilators, we're going to need a special program to create them outside the market through the government. And masks, well, we'll just do the best we can. Fauci at this point was telling people masks are not effective. I debate this with listeners occasionally because somehow Fauci becomes another way to express our partisan politics. But my memory is that the medical establishment, whether it's Fauci or not, discouraged individuals from using masks because there just weren't enough. Instead of finding market ways to increase them, we were told, oh, they don't work that well. And that way, medical people who were doing God's work, I mean, it was a terribly frightening time, and very brave nurses and doctors who felt a sense of responsibility did put their lives on the line and died. Many died. So my heart goes out to them, but I wish we had chosen a different way to increase the availability of masks rather than telling the public that we should not use them. And I wish that ventilators had not been some kind of special program. And I wish that vaccines had been given a price incentive. But none of those things happened. So tell me what, in your view at the time, in real time, what kind of conversations do you remember from that time? And what do we end up doing in each of those areas?
Sure. Well, my last day in the Oval Office was February 13th, 2020.
Okay.
So after that, you had to quarantine 2 weeks every time you turned. So that's it. I'm in Chicago from now on. But on that day in the Oval Office, we had a whole background with FDA policy prior to that, because one of the president's key promises was to bring down drug prices. And we had a major battle within the administration. Do we bring down drug prices with regulation or with deregulation? And the econ team was like, Peltzman showed us, you're going to, deregulation is a way to bring down prices. We already seen it work in cell phones and other areas. So, let's do it. And we did. I mean, Scott Gottlieb was brought on board very early. And Scott's approach was, we're going to bring down some of these FDA barriers. And
he was commissioner of the FDA.
Yeah, he was first commissioner at FDA in the Trump administration. And drug prices fell in nominal terms for the first time in 46 years, after going up beyond the rate of inflation in many years. So we had that background. The president himself had that background. I mean, it wasn't easy to get the FDA to approve these, especially generics back then. So the president himself had been engaged with the agency and learning how to turn that ship a little faster. And so at this day in the Oval Office, now we're in COVID. I think there were 13 COVID cases known, probably many more actually, but in February 13th, we were dealing with COVID, and a bunch of us staff are there, and we're demoralized. We're like, the FDA, we just can't move them. They're too slow. They don't want to do anything different. And I remember the president saying, guys, I've done this already. I'm going to do it again. Leave that to me. Don't worry. I know you're frustrated, but the FDA will go quick on this, and I'm going to make it happen.
There was a fourth thing I forgot about, which was the availability of tests. I mean, we had Paul Romer on the program very early in the pandemic talking about how allowing people to test themselves, even imperfectly, even if they didn't honor the result of the test and stay home, would have been a huge improvement in reducing the spread of the virus. I don't know if that's true. My suspicion is he's right. That was another terrible mistake. So in those cases, in none of those cases did we use the market in any way to respond to that emergency. Do you agree with that?
Well, first of all, there are regulatory barriers on the test, which shouldn't have been there. I mean, like the University of Illinois created its own test. It was allowed to use on its own employees and students, but they couldn't sell it to your college or any other place because that would be illegal. The FDA needed to approve that. So it was a regulatory barriers for sure. Certainly the mentality in government and our profession was not around, number one, supply. I hear you describing supply. Yeah. flatten, this whole flatten the curve. No, let's build more intensive care units. Let's not try to choke off demand by some other method. That's even with the Chinese, we're building hospitals like crazy. So there's a supply element. Also, I just think again, innovation, boring types of innovation, by having everybody stay home from work, where workplaces are the place that we formed to come up with ideas and implement things and cooperate together. And we weren't allowed to be together and cooperate. And we would have discovered some boring stuff, like how to implement tests or whatever. It would have been very boring, but it would have kind of worked. And we weren't allowed to do that. And I complained about that. I wrote about that in March of 2020 already, that we're killing innovation here, and innovation on the boring stuff is going to be crucial. Now, you said we didn't have a vaccine. We had a vaccine. The same day we closed schools in Chicago and most of America, March, I believe 16th or 18th, it was a Monday, was the day the vaccine was administered to humans. Now, it was under FDA auspices and everything. So I think warp speed was great and it got it quicker, but warp speed should have been even quicker. In March, we should have already had people voluntarily, they want to be first in line to get this vaccine. They could do it. Throughout the summer, more and more people would have tried. They wouldn't have grown horns. Other people would have signed up. So by the fall, we would have a lot of people already vaccinated. So the FDA was still a barrier there. Thankfully, they didn't take the normal 18 months, but the 9 months was too long, in my opinion.
Right. So it was a miracle. It was a scientific miracle, a incredible intellectual achievement of human beings to find a remarkably safe, not entirely, remarkably safe way to protect people from this disease. Then for the government, hey, they did it. I think, what was it, a week? Was it a week that Moderna took to?
January 6th, when they had their formula.
And they'd started.
I'm not sure when they started.
But I think I mean, it's slightly misleading. Obviously, it was the result of literally years and maybe decades of progress, slow and false starts, bad things that didn't work. But they once they got focused on it and were able to use that past knowledge, it was a week, I think, or a weekend. I think my memory is a weekend that they actually were able to specify the formula they thought would be effective. We didn't know if it would be, of course, as you say. We could have tried it on humans right away. Many people would have lined up to be those guinea pigs because they were scared, and they would have maybe seen it as a national a contribution to the country and to humanity. But that was not allowed, and so the process did have its somewhat normal stretch. So you could argue that, well, 9 months compared to 18 versus 3.5 years was also a miracle for the government. It's incredibly fast. But your point is that 9 months was incredibly costly. And in the case of an emergency like this, they might have taken a political risk. The president couldn't or didn't want to push that through. Instead, what he did is he subsidized the purchases of those of the first millions of vaccines to reduce the uncertainty that the industry faced in worrying about both pricing and confiscation. A lot of people argued we should just, once they figured out, we just confiscate it and they should get no money at all. It's immoral to profit from a vaccine. So again, whether the glass half full or half empty doesn't really matter, but that's what happened, right?
Yes, and also the manufacturing. We wanted those companies to get the assembly line going because they got to make billions. And this is something we had emphasized in the executive order in 2019. You're going to have to make billions of these things. So get working on it. And maybe the thing that you're going to make billions of doesn't even work and you're not going to end up shipping any out the door. But we want your assembly line ready. And that's where the advanced purchase came in.
And again, although I would have preferred probably a market response with charities being able to find ways to get access to these vaccines for people who couldn't afford a market price, that's not the way we went. I think, do you remember the budgetary cost of Operation Warp Speed, the expenditure?
It was $10 billion.
So that's a really small amount of money. Explain.
Yeah, the vaccine allowed us, having the vaccine allowed us to get back to more normal life. The other side of that is to cut these opportunity costs, the things that we weren't able to do because we were trying to escape that virus. Maybe some of those things are wasteful, but certainly public schools were explicitly linked. Their opening was explicitly linked to having the vaccine. So, blame that on the teachers union if you want, but we lived in a world with a teachers union. So the vaccine allowed those public schools to get open again eventually. So that allowed us to get back to normal. What's normal worth in our economy? Something like $1 trillion every 6 months. So we were saving $1 trillion, $2 trillion, something like that, by accelerating the distribution of this vaccine, and it cost the government $10 billion. Right, as many decimal places different. It was a spectacular rate of return on a government program. Although I focus more on the deregulation part of it than what the government was spending out of the Treasury.
Of course.
But if you want to put it in those terms, it was a great rate of return.
As an economist, my favorite part of your paper, you try to measure the benefits. It's hard to do. You have to make a lot of assumptions. The value of a life. Not every life is like the life of a 20-year-old is not worth the same as the life of an 85-year-old, and so on. And it's hard to put a monetary value on that. We understand that. But it's large, the benefits. What I enjoyed particularly about your paper as an economist is a recognition that when you don't allow certain things on the market, like a vaccine, people don't just go, oh, okay. They look for other ways to be safe. And so all the behaviors that we followed as individuals using the local knowledge of time and place, these include things like washing your groceries. And for those of you who are too young to remember this, because it was 3 years ago, in the early days of the pandemic, when you went to the grocery, you wiped down your cans and your packages of pasta because you did not know and you were worried that the virus could spread through contact that way. I don't think it turned out to be true. But there was a lot of things we did. That's one. We stayed away from our friends. That's two. People didn't go to school. That's three. All these things we did were the normal incentive-based responses that people have in periods of uncertainty and risk. And it's incredibly important. One of the great values of economics is reminding people that those things are going to happen. Certain chains of events of causation are going to be put in place. And as you say, every day that vaccine was not available deterred the return to normal life. And that was very costly.
Yeah, I think one of the theoretical contributions of the paper is conceptual, is to crystallize that idea that the alternatives, because the FDA has a limited jurisdiction, there are plenty of quack medicines outside their jurisdiction. And closing the schools is a quack medicine sold to us by the teachers union. Other countries weren't doing it, but the teachers union's not under the jurisdiction of the FDA, so they can sell closed schools as a quack medicine. People fall for it. And that's what we did. It doesn't have to be tested, whatever. We just did it. This is an issue I actually discussed with Scott Gottlieb toward the end of both of our terms. We weren't in COVID yet. I also saw this in opioids. And I was objecting. I said, Scott, when you guys think about opioid policy, which comes in their jurisdiction because some opioids are prescriptions, you guys totally ignore, and you refuse, not only ignore it, you refuse to consider other quack medicines that people will pursue if they can't get the prescriptions, such as heroin or fentanyl, which is outside their jurisdiction. And they were very much like lawyers, and they're like, that's not our jurisdiction. We don't care. I asked you, do you even make a phone call to the Department of Justice or DEA? No, they just totally ignore that. And we've had a lot of studies in economics making a pretty good case that by cracking down on prescriptions, actually more people died from opioids because they went outside FDA jurisdiction. So it's conceptually the same point, and it wasn't hard for me to see in COVID we were dealing with that issue.
Yeah, the point on the opioids, which you write about in the paper, is that OxyContin, which is a very powerful opioid that made a lot of people's lives more pleasant because it reduced their pain, who did not get addicted to it, but other people had struggled to deal with it, so they would be going to prescription mills. They were going to, through legal channels, they would go to a doctor, pretend their knee was in pain or whatever it was, and get access to this drug that was giving them solace in other ways than reducing the pain of their knee. And when that was not available, they turned to other methods. And of course, we've had Sam Quinones on the program talking about how people who distributed fentanyl and other drugs would be outside those prescription drug places looking for opportunities to sell their product on the street. They'd give them away. It was a lost leader. They gave away free samples to get people addicted to it. And your point is that the last thing we want to do is make it hard for people to get the dangerous drug, because there's an even more dangerous drug they're going to be taking instead. And that, as you say, that logic, I think part of it is jurisdictional, legal. Oh yeah, that's not our area. We don't worry about that. But I think it's also just, again, if you don't have the economist's mindset of, and then what? The worry about unintended consequences, I think it doesn't come as naturally to people who aren't trained in that style of thinking.
No, definitely our bread and butter, if we're still doing economic reasoning, is, what's the alternative? That demand curve we draw, it's the quantity of this compared to the next best alternative from the consumer's point of view. So you're right, it's very natural for us. I don't know how the prescription opioid thing comes out, but no doubt in my mind has to be part of the calculus.
Yeah.
You have to recognize that what the alternatives are in the real world, not what the doctors wish your alternative is, but what the real world alternative is.
I want to go back to the quack medicine of closing schools, which I have to confess, when you said that, Casey, I did get a little bit of a tremor in my stomach. That level of blunt honesty. What convinced? I remember at the time, the argument was, while it's true that children are less vulnerable to COVID, they will get it at school, spread it among themselves, playing on the playground, sitting in class, et cetera, et cetera. Then they'll go visit their grandparents and kill them. That, to me, or their teachers who are older than they are, and of course, that was the teachers' union who you're blaming. That was their concern, which is normal. That would be the incentives we'd expect them to do to protect their rank and file, pay their dues. How convinced are you that was an error, and what convinces you that was an error, given the logic that was made at the time, that was put forward at the time?
Yeah, so everybody recognized that the children were much less harmed by that virus in terms of the direct harm. Also, their parents, if their parents weren't terribly old, not an issue. Brothers and sisters, not an issue. Now, elderly people was an issue. Now, did elderly mean 60, 65, 70, 75? I mean, we didn't quite know at that time. So first, there was a principle in public health that you protect the vulnerable. You don't take healthy people and rearrange their lives. So the children were healthy. They were not vulnerable. Shouldn't be rearranging their lives. If there's some elderly teachers who need to be taken out or stay home, given permission to stay home. So that would be just a public health principle we already had, somehow forgot it all of a sudden. Also, economics is a quantitative science. So I could think through, okay, how many elderly teachers are there? How many non-elderly teachers maybe live with their parent or have an elderly spouse at home? We can calculate. And I wrote a paper calculating these kind of things. And yes, even if I acknowledge that there would be some extra deaths by having schools open, they would be quite rare compared to all the lost human capital among the children. So I estimated something like the risk of teaching in person. I was the only one in my department, by the way, teaching in person. But the risk of teaching in person is something like driving a couple times around the block. I mean, yeah, if I drive a couple times around the block, that's all the more time that I might get in a car crash. But it was a minuscule, on the orders of pennies per hour that you're teaching in person. It's not a zero in that view. So that's one part of economics. Another part of economics, what I mentioned earlier, these big organizations are good at cooperating, that's why we have these organizations. So my view is that workplaces and schools may end up being safer. Yeah, but holding constant prevention activity, they'd be less safe because that's what the epidemiologists tell us, when you're together, is going to spread more. But prevention is not going to be held constant. And an organization is better able to supply these local public goods. That's their whole point. And so you'll have more prevention, which is my prediction. And we were quickly seeing, like with the University of Illinois inventing its own tests, these larger organizations were doing a lot more preventions than people were at home. Also, the demand's lower at home. You know, the Samuelson formula for public goods is, well, we add the willingness to pay once for each person. And so in a big organization, it's got a willingness to pay of orders of magnitude bigger willingness to pay for prevention than the family does, or people living alone. And then the final part is Bayesian. I mean, is Bayesian economic statistics? I don't know, but we can update. Okay, so one of the things, it's kind of like automobile accidents. I gave that analogy. If we had a new traffic pattern on Lakeshore Drive in Chicago, one thing, we don't have to wait for people to die. We can just count the accidents, because the accidents are much more common. And you can say, oh, we get in a lot of accidents, we better go back to the drawing board. In COVID, you had accidents. They're called cases. So you could be measuring the cases before maybe anybody died and deal that way. But whereas if you never open the schools, then you never know what the cases are. So then there's also that Bayesian bias in favor of trying it out and doing some measurement. So that's a very strong economic case for having the schools open. I mean, maybe a lot of my colleagues weren't speaking up about it, but I think it was obvious.
Yeah, Emily Oster has spoke about it very early, and we've interviewed her about it here. I want to go back to it was almost an aside. You said, we forgot this public health principle to first protect the vulnerable. There was a paranoia, which was hard to avoid, which was other people are dangerous. And so I need to stay away from them. I think if we had not locked out schools, not locked down workplaces, places of entertainment, for example, bars, restaurants, I think a lot of people would have stayed home for a while. They did. I mean, we saw this. You can see it in the data on cell phone leaving the house and other travel movement. There was a voluntary lockdown that took place as people sought to escape other people. And, my favorite was I'd see people, and I'm sure you can still see it, people driving in their cars with a mask on by them, with no one else in the car. Or people walking on the street outside 10 feet away from other people wearing a mask. Some of that was ignorance. We didn't understand it fully, but some of it I think was literally superstition, magic. I don't know what you want to call it, but a feeling that here's a I can't remember the word right now. A thing talisman. That's the word. I've got a talisman. I have a magic thing that I'm doing the right thing, and therefore I will be safe. And so that was going on in the beginning. But after a while, I think people adjusted their views of the danger of it, and we learned more about it. But we never went to the place that you said before this we all knew was the right place, which was protect the vulnerable. 3 epidemiologists, one of them, Jay Bhattacharya, who's been on the program, suggested that we should have focused on that, and we should continue to focus on it in the middle of the pandemic. They have been vilified beyond imagination. which I think is one of the darkest moments in public health, and certainly institutional honesty. The role that government institutions played in trying to suppress that viewpoint is deeply disturbing to me. And of course, those brave people paid a price for that. I salute them. But the people who spoke out. But the point I want to add, and I've never spoken, I don't think, about this on the program, but somehow it's now easier to talk about with the passage of time. An economist who I will not name, because I haven't gotten his permission, but at the time I remember him telling me, "Don't tell anybody I said this, but do you think the following is true?" And the following was, most of the leadership of America's political institutions and a lot of America's corporate institutions, they're old. And if we have a focus on the vulnerable, we're going to have trouble keeping our positions of influence because younger people are going to step forward and we're going to be eventually the only ones who are quarantined. Let's quarantine everybody. Now, only an economist would have a thought like that, an economist trained in public choice and incentives. You want to react to that?
One of my early papers in my career was called Gerontocracy. So what can I say? I mean, you look at a lot of the redistribution that government does. I mean, it has this reputation of redistributing from rich to poor. It's not true. It redistributes from young to old. The government's been doing that for over 100 years now. And this was a regulatory element of that instead of through the fiscal, treasury activities. But so you could see the pressure there. I mean, but what we were saying earlier, that other people are a source of germs, viruses, bacteria, all this, microscopic, nasty stuff. Yeah, but the economists, our job, is about what being with other people, the value it has. I mean, that's why we're not cavemen, because we come to a workplace with more than just our family and get together, combine our talents, and do amazing things. And, I think it was malpractice to not be pointing that out. Let the doctors do their part and tell us about the germs, but let the economists do their part and say, being together is essential, even for health. Even for health. And we've seen a lot of people dying from non-COVID causes, even to this day, dying from non-COVID causes beyond the normal rates. And that, I think, the disrupting all the amazing things we do together is at the root cause of that.
Well, there's a subtle point here, which really we lose a lot of friends and invitations to the best cocktail parties because we point this out as economists. But the goal of life is not to live forever or as long as possible. The goal of life is to get the most out of life. I wrote that. Turned out, by the way, I first heard that from a graduate student at George Mason University who heard it from, who said the goal of economics is how to get the most out of life. And she said she heard it from a professor, didn't remember which one. I quoted it in my Adam Smith book. And I want to confess that in my next book, Wild Problems, I don't like that formulation, the get the most out of. I don't like the maximizing flavor of that. I know it's essential in a way to our methodological approach to the world, but I think there's a skill to getting the most out of life without trying to. It's a subject for another time, but it turns out the quotes, it appears to be from George Bernard Shaw, which is incredibly amusing. I just recently stumbled across that. But whether you debate about this maximizing, get the most out of, economists don't think that the goal is to take zero risk, because risk comes with reward. And reward's important. And, I see these people walking around still. In Israel, we haven't paid attention to masks for forever. I went back to the United States a month or two ago, and I went to San Francisco. And there are a lot of people wearing masks, a lot of people worried about COVID, and I feel like I'm in an alternative universe. And just the wearing of the mask, which I don't want to debate whether it's efficacious or not, I have no idea. But I know what the cost is. I don't see your face. I don't see your smile. I don't. The look in your eye is not the same as the look I can perceive when you're not wearing a mask, and it degrades the human experience. Now, I think for a lot of non-economists, they say, but that is irrelevant compared to death. And the economist's natural response is, well, some things are worth dying for. And I would say living is worth dying for. I don't want to live a life that's long devoid of human contact. It's radical. Go ahead. What are your thoughts?
Well, of course, yeah. I mean, the economics says that. I mean, our use of the value of a statistical life is acknowledging that. And it's not imposing it from on high and saying, here's what I think life's worth. This is what people in their own lives have historically revealed life to be worth. They get in a car to do something other than save a life. And that there's a risk that they would die from that. So that's all of us were using that concept. So in that sense, we were all acknowledging that. But it ended up being so perverse in the United States, at least, and other countries, I think. Maybe not Israel, but a bunch of European countries, is we actually weren't getting more life. I mean, the big effect on life expectancy through non-COVID causes. People dying from alcohol, drugs, traffic, homicide, diabetes, heart, stroke. It's a huge number of deaths, and these tend to be in younger people, certainly compared to the COVID deaths. And the COVID deaths have basically stopped. These other things I talked about haven't stopped. So I think in the end of the day, we lost more life years from trying to avoid COVID than COVID actually got out of us. And that, again, goes back to what I say, that being with other people is how we do amazing things, and including enhancing our health, including treating our diabetes, including treating our alcoholism, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we actually got in, you're talking about the trade-off. We actually got, I think, in the part of the frontier where the trade-off might have gone in the other direction, wasn't a trade-off, or I'm not 100% sure about that, but it's just how perverse that you even got in the zone that we could have the conversation that by trying to save lives, we actually costed lives.
But you feel very confident, and this would be my default, that the vaccine, the first 2 doses, which were the doses that were the original shots, were very powerful in reducing risk of death. I stopped after 3. I was told, by the way, that proved that I was a partisan. Obviously, and my ideology, I actually had a person tell me that my ideology had overwhelmed my rational sense that I wouldn't take a 4th dose. And I know people who've taken 5, and I know people who have a lot of health issues that they attribute to the vaccine. I don't know if it's true. I don't think we know that yet. There are some obvious things that are attributable to the vaccine. Heart damage among young men, for example, seems to be a problem. But I don't think we know very much about the impact of multiple times toying with our immune system. But I worry about it. And it seemed to me, and I still believe this, obviously, that the risk from COVID now is quite small with the variants that are on the table. Is that an accurate summary of how you feel as well in terms of the efficacy of the vaccine?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of that's not my expertise. What I did focus on early on was the death rate in the nursing homes, which was very high. And then miraculously, through COVID, deaths went to nothing in a few weeks' time. And that few weeks was the same few weeks that we rolled out the vaccine. Did something else happen at the same time? I'll leave it somebody else to discover. But again, the sort of Bayesian approach is like, there's a significant chance that vaccine was good for elderly people in terms of getting them to live longer. And I think that's the approach you're going to have to take. Was it good for everyone? It should have been voluntary. I mean, we never, in the work we did on vaccine innovation during the pandemic, we never suggested this should be forced on people. It should be a matter of choice, and that's caused a lot of problem, forcing it on people.
By forcing it, you mean you can't work here, you can't go eat in this restaurant, and so on. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, right. You want to visit somebody in a prison in Illinois? If they're not vaccinated, you can't visit them. That's for example. It's not that the visitor has to be vaccinated. That's also true, but the visitor can't even consider visiting. I mean, they use it as such a weapon and a cudgel against people. My own employer required us to get the vaccine, the first 2 doses, and the bonus dose. We dropped it. We were pretty quick to drop compared to our competitors, but that really backfired. It's one of the regrets I have when we worked on Warp Speed. We were working on Obamacare at the same time. And every time we had an Obamacare meeting, we're like, can you think of a dumber marketed product than Obamacare? Because people were paying not to be on Obamacare with the mandate penalty and things like that. But then I'd have a meeting the same day, later in the day, about Warp Speed. And I never thought to say, maybe our report needs to say that the marketing should be in the private sector. The government should not be marketing this stuff because they're going to ruin the brand. We didn't say that. I take personal responsibility. And we saw what happened when it was viewed as a Trump vaccine, the Democrats were saying they'd never take it. And then when it became a Biden vaccine, then the Republicans wouldn't take it. That should have been left to Madison Avenue, who knows how to reach people and their heterogeneous populations we have.
Looking back now again, we're almost, I hope, in a position to think about this as a moment in history rather than an ongoing problem. What do you think is the biggest, you've named a few things, but what do you think is the biggest lesson from the pandemic that we have failed to learn as a world? I'm struck by how little we've learned, period. But if you had to prioritize and say, I wish we had drawn this conclusion at least, what would be the one that you think is the most important?
I think the power of freedom. I think freedom really showed well. I'm going to confess, I underestimated freedom. I was talking about it in March 2020, but in hindsight, I've been more aggressive. And with this idea that when we can get together and trade with each other and cooperate together, without the directions from on high, just what we and our groups think is going to be progress for us, that really leads to flourishing. We've known it from history, but it really helped to see it again. The idea of opportunity cost is related to that. Opportunity cost went from the number one hardest thing to teach in economics classes to the number one easiest thing to teach through the pandemic. So that can be a lesson that we take away, because we all got to see really how voluntary behavior works.
I'm not going to name any names, but when the pandemic started, I remember vividly many people saying, it was a riff on the phrase, there are no atheists in a foxhole. The riff was, there are no libertarians in a pandemic. The people like yourself, not you, people like you, people like me who have championed freedom and the virtues of the kind of local interactions that you're talking about, the cooperation that takes place among individuals voluntarily, using the knowledge that only people on the ground have, and how the market mobilizes that information through cooperation. It's a story that we will be telling for the rest of our lives in our profession, because it's a story that's hard to understand and it's hard to internalize, but that's our story. But at the pandemic, many people when it hit, many people felt that the risk was so large of association that we had to stay home in every dimension as much as possible. I don't think anyone besides a handful of people who, most of them are, I think that I know of, not by chance, but most of them are economists. I'm sure there are others outside our field, but I don't think most people feel that that was a mistake at all. I think they're glad we closed the schools. They're glad we locked down entertainment events. They're glad we shut down the NBA, which was voluntary, by the way, that they ended their season. The NCAA tournament, March Madness basketball was shut down voluntarily, maybe out of threat or fear of government reaction. But I do think there was a big interaction, a big reaction of fear. And I don't know if that would be any different the next time. So, and certainly people in responsibility were not eager to take the blame for that mistake. There's two types of errors you can make, 1 and 2. And I think in general, people will always make the error of omission. They will do something that is looks safe, but the costs are hidden. Do you have any more optimism than I do about that?
Well, I think those of us whose profession is to examine opportunity costs, hopefully we're better at articulating that and delivering that message. And I think it will be an easier message to deliver, both in terms of the messenger having confidence, but also the receiver hearing it. Anyone who lived through this pandemic will not have as much trouble understanding the opportunity costs because they saw it. Now we have a new generation who never saw this pandemic. They may have to learn anew, but opportunity costs is an obvious thing now. Even to those who think the schools are worth shutting down are acknowledging the opportunity cost. Because it's obvious.
My guest today has been Casey Mulligan. Casey, thanks for being part of EconTalk.
Well, it's a lot of fun, Russ.
This is EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. For more EconTalk, go to econtalk.org, where you can also comment on today's podcast and find links and readings related to today's conversation. The sound engineer for EconTalk is Rich Goyette. I'm your host, Russ Roberts. Thanks for listening. Talk to you on Monday.